Your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man has finally concluded its first season, and I've been covering it predominantly on my live streams with at least one separate video at the very beginning, and I told myself I'm gonna hold off, especially since it looked like there wasn't really too much demand or discussion or really anything that sparked any kind of like debate amongst people that are fans of Spider-Man, fans of Marvel Studios and the MCU and the grand scheme of things. And now with all 10 episodes finally up for streaming and available, I thought to myself, okay, now I think it's a bit more appropriately to make one final video encompassing my thoughts of the overall season, what my impressions are of the show, and whether or not it's really going to be worthy of someone's time, or even my own, going into a second and third season for which the show has already been greenlit for. And maybe a little bit of that silence and potential drop-off could be kind of understood. I'm not saying that the show 100% deserved it, because if you guys remember from those initial impressions that I had in that very first video that I put out, and to kind of recap on those impressions, I thought to myself that the show was overall okay. There were some things about it that worked and some others that it didn't. I didn't really like the dialogue. Again, the very quintessential phrasing to kind of quote skill up a little bit, especially not only with certain games like Dragon Age the Veilguard, but even keeping it within the theme of Spider-Man. Marvel's Spider-Man 2, there's times where characters would talk to one another in that game, much like they do in this show, as if HR is in the room. Like I said, to paraphrase skill up a little bit, it's like HR is listening in on them and they're trying to make sure that they talk to each other like everything is happy-go-lucky and very sanitized and kind of unnatural. And frankly, for the most part, it felt like that nuance to the dialogue and to the chemistry and the relationship between the two characters, between several different characters, especially when it comes to some of those vocal performances, despite the quality being not too bad and even being quite good in some cases, with Hunter Thames playing our protagonist Peter Parker, to, again, in my opinion, the overall standout of the entire season, Coleman Domingo as Norman Osborn. Say what you want about what they did with the character as far as certain technical visual aspects about the character aside, if they at least had to go that route, at least they cast a really good actor to portray him. And to be quite honest, he sticks the landing, even up until the very last episode of this first season. I thought to myself, this interpretation of Norman Osborn is a standout, and I'm curious to see what he does next. And while on that note, I feel like Norman Osborn kind of embodies one of the things that I did enjoy about the show, that I even enjoyed from those initial impressions, was that they were taking certain chances and making some creative decisions as far as the backstory, because everybody knows Spider-Man, everybody knows where he came from, everybody knows what the mythology is. With great power comes great responsibility. So this show was at least trying to make some steps forward to try to divert from that. And I think it did kind of like a half and half sort of mixture of some things that really did work quite well in terms of giving us something kind of fresh and new. But then there's others where it gets kind of murky and almost a little schizophrenic as far as playing with itself. And one of those aspects would have to be just how obvious it is that the show was intended to be part of the MCU, and then at the last second they kind of retconned it to not be, to overhauling some character designs, even though you have some things that kind of are pulled from the MCU, but then you change it up to not have it be part of the MCU. And this is in the trailer, so it's not a major spoiler, but Doctor Strange, when he shows up, you can blatantly tell from his actual getup that he's not meant to be the Doctor Strange that we have in the MCU, the Benedict Cumberbatch version, with the overall aesthetical choices that they had, down to even him having the yellow gloves this time around, with, again, some slight overhaul to his, the suit, his look, the little Errol Flynn kind of mustache as opposed to the overall major goatee. So you can see that, they're going for a much more classic Jack Kirby kind of inspired look to him. But when he shows up, you got the Michael Giacchino theme from the MCU. So I'm like, okay, which one is it? So there's various other aspects about that feels like it's at odds with one another. And that also kind of stems to another thing that started off as something that I didn't really like, but I kind of warmed up to it, which has to be the animation style. Especially as I kind of hit the halfway point, there were areas where I thought to myself, you know, when you really freeze frame certain shots of the animation, it actually does look quite beautiful and feels very inspired from those classic 1960s and even a little bit into the 70s art style from the original Ditko, Kirby, and of course Stan Lee era. You could argue Silver Age and Golden Age of Marvel, and it looks legitimately kind of brought to life. It's once it kind of gets a little animated that you then remind yourself that it's computer generated, it's simulated in a way that probably feels like you just kind of create the rigs and just animate it from that point forward. You really don't have to do too much in the way of design. But at the same time, that's only me speculating. I'm an armchair animator, so I'm not necessarily going to say that it took shortcuts or anything like that. But I can honestly say that towards the back half of the season, I kind of warmed up to it, and it didn't really bother me as it did at the very beginning. And it was also in this middle way point around episodes 4 and 5 that I thought that the choreography behind some of the fight scenes and again a little bit of the relationships with the characters I was starting to warm up to. I was starting to kind of finally sit a little bit more comfortably with. But at the same time, that also brought forward another problem that I started to develop with the show, which is that I felt like it was kind of beginning to meander. I felt like we really weren't going anywhere as far as stakes, as far as actually having something at the back of our heads to go, okay, what's going to become of this? We had certain villains and henchmen kind of feeling a little villain of the weekish kind of thing, especially since they were starting to drop hints of major Rogue Gallery villains kind of coming into the fold and actually building an origin around them, specifically Lonnie Lincoln. For a little while there, I was thinking to myself, why are we spending so much time around Lonnie Lincoln the way that we're kind of, like I said, feeling a little juxtaposed to what's going on with Peter? And sure, once we get to like episodes 4, 5, maybe a little bit of 6, I was kind of digging what they were doing with Lonnie Lincoln and the character that he's going to become. And for those of you who are Spider-Man fans, you know exactly who he is going to become. It's no spoilers, no surprise. But the build-up was at least being gradually paced well with him. It's just that it was kind of taking away from a little bit of what's going on with Peter to where I'm like, well, Peter's got it kind of easy street to where everything looks like it's working out. Now, granted, this is Spider-Man we're talking about. The shoe is eventually going to have to drop, but right now, I'm just not giving the impression that it's going to. And again, we're going with the sanitized dialogue. Stakes aren't exactly presented. And for the halfway point, or even a little bit more past the halfway point, you could even argue about 60% of the way there with the 6th episode, I was like, guys, we're running out of time here. Are we really going to finally drop the gauntlet? And to make matters only worse, we had some characters that were then now becoming a little unlikable. In the case of Nico, who's meant to be Peter's best friend this time around, lesser so than Harry Osborn. We're barely really meeting Harry Osborn, not just as an audience, but even Peter himself is barely getting acquainted with him and becoming part of the team. Again, a little bit of a change in the usual mythology where you have Harry not really being in the know as far as who Peter is, what his ultimate goal is. So they're kind of flip-flopping that a little bit. But again, he's just kind of always giving the thumbs up. Sure, he's like a rich boy, but there was just nothing inherently compelling about him. And then again, just to add onto that mixture, Nico was getting on my nerves. She was annoying me. I'm trying to understand exactly why she was getting irritated, especially with something that unfolds later on. But at the same time, even prior to that thing that revealed to her, I was like, she's still kind of unlikable. She's got that quintessential rebellious attitude where anyone with money is automatically the devil, and I'm like, here we go. There's that character that they have to shove in there and is instantly unlikable, and we're being told that her and Peter are best friends, but I never get the feel that they are best friends. You need to show it, not tell it. And I never got that feeling from the two of them, especially when, again, the voice feels like they're being recorded in two separate booths, probably on separate occasions, and that in and of itself is not winning me over. And it's also in this middle part where they get a little bit more invested into some things that, again, you can tell are lifted from the MCU. Not a spoiler because, again, this was in the behind-the-scenes stuff and even some of the trailers, but this is supposed to be kind of beginning prior to Civil War and then during Civil War, but swapping Tony Stark for Norman Osborn as that mentor figure. However, even though they swapped that, they didn't swap out the actual fight that broke out between the Avengers in regards to the Sokovia cards, and you still have that happening here, but they overhauled some of the design choices as far as how Cap looks, how Tony looks, how even Ant-Man in some of those screenshots look, how even Winter Soldier looks with his classic style, even down to having the mask on him. I'm like, yeah, I get it, guys, but at the same time, it's distracting. And those aren't the only cameos that sometimes pop out here and there. There were some other ones that I felt were a little bit distracted. One in particular shows up at the literal very final episode, in fact, one of the final minutes of that final episode, and I was like, why is that there? If anything, it's, like I said, distracting me. It's pulling me out, especially since it's referring to something else within the Disney Plus MCU stuff that is technically now over. You guys ended it and are not continuing it. So I don't understand exactly why you're kind of crowbarring it in here. And some of these things frankly needed to be cut at the last second. So we weren't exactly in a great place here. And I was thinking to myself, oh God, am I really gonna have to dip from the show? But episode 7 happens. And finally we're reminded why Spider-Man simply just can't have the things go easy for him, and he's eventually stricken with that classic Parker luck. Let's just say that it's at the very end of episode 7 that, sorry for being vulgar here, but the show's balls finally drop, and I'm like, okay, now we're talking, now we're cooking with gas. And frankly, from that point forward, the show gets its momentum back, the pacing is a lot tighter, the stakes are escalated, and it's starting to feel like an actually well-done Saturday morning cartoon that's kind of giving me some vibes from the original 1994 animated series. We're not at the level of quality of Spectacular Spider-Man. There's been some comparisons I've seen online of people saying that this is the best show since Spectacular Spider-Man. Gotta be honest, pumping the brakes right there. I'm still not willing to give it that title just yet. It can maybe reach that in its eventual second season, but right now I could say that it at least managed to finish a little bit more strong than it was doing at the very beginning. Now granted, you could still argue that having its last third being effectively really well done versus having 2/3 of the show being awkwardly paced, and again having kind of like a half and half mixture of quality, varying degrees of quality, you could argue that maybe this season could have turned out a little bit better, but at least it ended strong with, like I said, strong pacing, good stakes, and even going into some bold and very dark directions to the point where I'm like, what rating is this? Is this really TVPG? Because we got some blood, we got some stabbing, we got some violence, we got some legitimate kills in a way that made me peel my eyes. I mean, it's not like the most graphic thing ever, but even now I'm looking at the show like, okay, well, why was this earlier? But the actual, like, violent stuff is not the only thing that gets a little bit more ominous and interesting and even juicier, even though I do appreciate, like I said, the choreography being a little bit better. I'm sorry, this is probably going to be the only real spoiler that I'll mention here before I finally get to a proper spoiler section, but the classic suit finally makes its debut here. You knew it was coming, and frankly, it feels a lot less Stark influence, so you're at least getting a little bit more of a classic Kirby-like design to the Spider-Man suit. I still wish that maybe it would have had a little bit of something to kind of distinguish it as its own thing, as opposed to having a little bit too much familiarity with the classic suit or even some stuff from Spider-Man the Animated Series or Spectacular Spider-Man, but still, it's doing the job, and of course, we're probably going to be getting something a little bit more upgraded in Season 2. At the end here, some things couldn't be saved. Like I said, some of the dialogue still feels a little bit clinical, a little unnatural. And speaking of that setup with Norman or any other of the elements of the show, I do feel like maybe they could have been stretched out and paced a little bit better, as opposed to literally taking nothing but Season 2 setup and compiling it into a montage for like the final 2 minutes. The last 2 minutes of that final episode is literally nothing but like, but wait, there's more, and it feels a little gimmicky, if that makes any kind of sense. I feel like some of those should have been put in like the last episode or 2 episodes back, so it could feel a little bit more natural instead of just being bam, season 2, bam, season 2, bam. You know what I'm saying? It just feels like too much there at the end. It's like you're eating a dessert, and it's a dessert that comes with like nuts and, fruit pieces, but you already ate all the nuts and the fruits, and the only thing left at the end of the dessert is all the sugary bits with like nothing but ice cream and chocolate. But someone says, finish it or I will, and so you finish it and you're like, oh, too much sugar. You kind of wish that you would have left with a little bit of those nuts or a little bit of that fruit so that it felt all quite balanced, but you're getting too much sugar at the end. Or like when you're finishing a frappe and you got most of the ice and the coffee already out, and at the bottom you have nothing but, like I said, just the syrup and the whipped cream, and you're like, too much sugar, and you kind of just want to throw it away. That's kind of like all those Easter eggs and little ta-da, to be continued type of moments at the end should have been stretched out, or at least spread out in a much more easy to digest kind of charcuterie board. But I will pay my compliments to at least saying that prior to those major season 2 cliffhangers, we did have a final sequence that at least brought things back full circle to at the beginning, towards something that I thought of myself was gonna feel just kind of left by the wayside and never quite answered, but it literally brought things full circle, like completely full circle, if you get every sense of that meaning. And effectively, it kind of wrapped things up for the most part in a season 1 that ultimately, despite its bumps and bruises, I thought to myself, you know what? I'm still kind of glad that I watched this. I am. Still has its problems as far as the things that I personally didn't gravitate towards, and then other things that I do feel a little bit, like I said, inauthentic, whether it be certain characterizations or certain choices, certain swaps, if you get my drift. Because again, it's not about the actual swap itself, but the inauthenticity behind it. How transparent and obvious it is that things are kind of there, to where I'm like, well, what was the need for you to do it in the first place? I'm not going to go as far as to like make a big deal of it on social media as far as like posting like a paragraph or ranting about it. I just kind of move on, but make no mistake, I'm not oblivious. I can see right through those creative decisions, but at least some of the decisions were not being able to affect what I was able to kind of walk away as some of the positives about the show, which are for the most part at the very end, or at least in the last third, where we are able to kind of hit that momentum in stride. And walking away as a Spider-Man fan, I can at least be left with a little bit of hope that they can at least gravitate towards those things that worked in that last third and just stick with them. The stuff with Lonnie Lincoln, some of those things that did in fact work for me, as far as that season 2 tease montage at the end, as well as the strengths of what makes Spider-Man Spider-Man. And I feel like they actually walked closer to that rather than walked away. And I never felt like any aspect about what makes Peter Parker Spider-Man and the hero to root for ever felt really betrayed. Again, some things from the wayside could have been improved, but at least the core heart of what makes this character a relatable one, and one that Spider-Man fans often like to see, in not just in live action, in the comics, in games, but also in animation, could still be found here. It's just a little bit of time to get there, and I'm hoping that we don't have to wait that amount of time within a second or third season. So now, with my final thoughts out of the way, let's talk spoilers. Now, I'm not going to cover every single little thing, every single Easter egg, not only because there's bound to be some that I'm going to miss because, frankly, they just didn't get imprinted into my brain all that much, but then there's others that I think stood out to me just a little bit more than the others that, frankly, I look at it and go, okay, that's kind of interesting. But anyways, and some of those include Harry Osborn developing his own business called Web. I gotta be honest, I'm like, okay, cool, he's gonna start up his own business, but frankly, I really don't care for this. And even though she was able to kind of redeem herself as far as apologizing, seeing how much of a douche she was being, Nico and her implementation into the show, and kind of giving us a broader sense of her Wiccan powers, because I understood who Nico was prior to even the show starting, and understand that she's got like a supernatural thing happening with her, and how she's able to speak to her mom from the beyond. But frankly, the needle's not really moved in any kind of direction with her. And again, having her be very surly there at the beginning towards Peter and towards even other characters that were trying to make an effort to be likable towards her didn't really help matters either way as well. Having Norman be the one to give him the "with great power" speech, but then taking it and swapping it from responsibility to respect, I honestly did do that. It's one of those fan servicey moments that I thought to myself, okay, this is actually kind of nice. And again, it's only making me kind of grab onto the dynamic relationship between Peter and Norman, that even if we were to kind of fall into the same tropes that we've known Spider-Man to be, as far as Norman becoming the Green Goblin and eventually being one of his arch nemesis, we're at least seeing a seed of it being planted in a different kind. It's almost like the same seed for the same plant we've seen before, but planted in a completely different form of soil. If that analogy makes any kind of sense. And frankly, it's at least creating us a proper sense of us kind of seeing this relationship grow, or at least proceed forward, so that when they do get to that eventual fight, we're at least going to feel something. It's not going to feel vapid. It's not going to feel empty, especially seeing that Norman is making moves here towards the very end of the season. And again, it's making things being a bit more palpable. And having Norman not only send in for the glider when Peter almost died at the hands of Scorpion, but even further improving on the glider, as we're being told by the scientists there at the end. Of course, it's kind of dropping the hints that he is eventually going to become our Green Goblin, or at least he's got the tools to become Green Goblin. But frankly, if there was anything about Norman Osborn that has me intrigued going into the second season, apart from the fact that he goddamn tried to open up a portal that then Doctor Strange had to come in and be like, yo, what the hell are you doing? Thus bringing us full circle to the sequence at the beginning, and in a very paradoxical sort of way. I feel like the biggest takeaway that I looked at and went, oh, this is kind of interesting, is of course, like always, a piece of that goddamn symbiote, who apparently wasn't Venom. It was a symbiote. It was a symbiotic alien, but it wasn't necessarily the Venom that we knew, which makes sense considering how much of a, main, Met Gala kind of design he had going for him, as well as the claws. But it does kind of beg the question, who is going to become Venom this time around? Because so far, we haven't been introduced to Eddie Brock. And lately, I feel like an awful lot of people who are in charge of the creative decisions around Spidey-related stuff have kind of been playing around with who Venom is. I believe recently there's been a bit of a debacle about Venom and who is playing him right now in the comics. Like, there was a bit of an uproar on Reddit and on Twitter. He was kind of trending a little bit for a while. And even recently, Spider-Man 2, the video game, played around with the concept of who Venom truly was. So now, I'm intrigued to see if Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man is going to be tackling Venom in a completely different capacity. One could even argue that maybe Harry Osborn, this version at least, could become Venom. Or, if I had to be a betting man, I would say that our Venom could be Amadeus, the guy who actually rejected the web invitation for Harry Osborn and stood steadfast with Oscorp with the internship as he got promoted. And I think one of the reasons, besides the fact that he stood with Oscorp and he stayed over there and he's got the position there, it would have to be really his personality. It strikes me very Eddie Brockish. Even though it's not Eddie Brock and it's a completely different character, his personality, his cockiness, his rivalry with Peter from a scientific perspective, I feel like there's enough there to kind of give him the archetypal kind of demeanor for him to then get the symbiote, become all buffed up Venom, and have the motivation, the incentive to be like, Peter, going after him. And so he's got that personality that makes me strike as like the type of rivalry and, like I said, the type of nefarious attitude that Eddie Brock had when he was combating with Peter for the photographer job. There were some ones that were kind of curious visual little details and implementations, but at the same time, I personally can't really speak on what really can come of this, to be quite honestly. Like, Doc Ock looks like he's creating his arms. He never really wore the arms, but he had them in his garage, and he only had like 2 or 3, but when he was putting together the drawings there in his cell, is it just me, or did he have more than just 4 more arms? He had like 8. So that combined with his, and I know you were thinking, Doc Ock, 8 of course, but the whole concept of Doc Ock is that he's got 4 along with his 4 limbs. That's what makes 8. So 8 plus 4 more limbs, that's 12. So we're going with a much more souped up Doc Ock. Is he maybe on the path to becoming Monster Ock from the PS1 game? I don't know. But like I said, there's not much more that I can really speak on that theory, as well as about how cool it was to have Daredevil played by Charlie Cox, but at the same time, him investigating Oscorp and then sending in his partner Finesse in there to kind of scope it up. It was absolutely no coincidence that the same episode that he shows up was also the same one where she kind of walks in and be like, oh, my bad. Immediately I was like, yeah, this girl's up to something. I'm not really too familiar with Finesse. I don't really know too much about her, but I knew that there was something about this character with the short hair, apart from the fact that she wasn't wearing the lab coat. She was being a little rebellious towards the the jerk doctor with the hair and the superiority complex, and the fact that she was just kind of setting herself apart. I'm like, something's going on with her, and sure enough, she is actually going to be Finesse, someone that's helping out Daredevil on the side. Now, again, going back to what I was mentioning before, this Daredevil arguably has a completely different suit and a different design than the Netflix/Disney Plus one that we got coming up here with Born Again, but he's still being voiced by Charlie Cox. I don't know if it's fan service or an actual intention to have him be integrated into the grand picture of things, but it makes everything kind of confusing. Guys, we need some answers here. And right now, there's not much more that I can pull about how exactly he knew that Oscorp was coming up with this big machine and whether or not he's going to have a bigger role to play in Season 2. I don't know. But I'll be honest, out of all the things that they kind of left us there with some teases at the end to lead us into Season 2, the big one that I looked at and went, okay, was Richard Parker, Peter's dad, still being alive, being incarcerated out of all things, and to me, the biggest thing that put a smile on my face, he's voiced by Josh Keaton. Josh Keaton, who played our Peter Parker Spider-Man from Spectacular Spider-Man. I was like, all right, way to bring things full circle. And then on top of that, he's played Spider-Man in various other incarnations, even some of the video games, like, I believe, Edge of Time and also Shattered Dimensions. He was in there somewhere. Not Web of Shadows, that was somebody else. But those two games and then various other instances where he's done plenty of other voice work. But it's good to see that he still has some work to do for Spider-Man related animation. And to have him be Richard Parker, I think is a fine, nice touch. But I'm very, very, very interested to see exactly what got him incarcerated. I know that there's been different plays to have Richard Parker survive his original fate and actually still being alive, but always have something happening with him that was kind of, like dealing with some black market stuff, or he was dealing with like some experiments and things like that weren't exactly on the ethical side. And he was kind of they even try to play with that a little bit with the Andrew movies, the Andrew Garfield Amazing Spider-Man movies. There's that deleted scene that reveals, spoilers, in the original Amazing Spider-Man 2, Richard was supposed to still be alive, and he finally confronts Peter there at the end. But that was a deleted scene. They scrapped that. So I'm intrigued to see if finally we're going to have someone or some group of people in the form of animation finally do justice of what it would be like in an alternate reality to have Richard Parker still be alive and seeing what kind of ramifications come out of that. And frankly, those are all the really spoilery things that I took away and thought to myself, these are the ones that really stood out to me. Again, there's plenty of other little references and things like that that I heard and went, okay, that's fine, but I'm moving on and didn't really gravitate didn't really stick with me. And granted, there's plenty of other Easter eggs that were mainly there just for fan service. There's like some lines of dialogue that I can blatantly tell that we're trying to reference the Tobey Maguire movies and things like that. So overall, I walked away pretty satisfied and adequately tamed with the Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man show. But I can only hope that they can at least stick with what worked and leave behind what didn't. And right now, I am somewhat confident that can happen, but I'm still keeping my faith at a little bit of arm's length. But what do you guys think so far of Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man? Let me know down below. If it's a spoiler, probably put like a little bit of a disclaimer or anything like that, like some spaces so that people who haven't caught up on the show don't get it ruined it for themselves. And while you guys are down there, hit the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this full review finally of the first season of Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man. Time will tell if maybe this time next year I'll catch season 2. We'll see. And until next time, guys, stay humble and take care.